Jesse Kelly was on Glenn Beck talking about the role that teachers' unions have had to play in the harmful things done to kids over the last couple years. You know exactly what I'm talking about. We're going to get to that in just a second here. But first, I want to give a shout out to our new sponsor, Noble Gold. Now is the time to start thinking about inflation. I know that the prices are killing me. I'm sure you're in the same boat. This way, you're always moving forward. You're growing your money. You're making money, and you're not losing it. Imagine if you do this, you have more financial freedom, which results in having more fun. Start a gold IRA with Noble Gold now and fight inflation. This month, for every IRA above $20K, you get an incredible 3-ounce silver American Virtue coin completely free as a thank you. You can't go wrong with Noble Gold. Call 1-877-646-5347. Call that number now to find out more, or visit noblegoldinvestments.com. Also, click the link in the description that brings you directly to the information you need. Thank you to Noble Gold. All right, let's get into it. Jesse Kelly, he was on Glenn Beck's program, and what he talked about was essentially the role that teachers' unions have had. I'm just going to pull that up here, and we're going to watch this together. But he talked about the role that teachers' unions have had in this lockdown ideology. I was a teacher at the beginning of 2020. The last time I was in a classroom would have been March 2020, just before the 2 weeks to slow the spread began. And it was strange. It was a strange time. A lot has happened since then, as we know. And before I give my full opinion on it, let's just see what he has to say, because, to be honest, what he has to say hits the money. It hits it right on the mark. He's right on the money is the analogy that I'm trying to use. And he explains just the culpability that this institution of teachers unions has in the harm that's been done to children. Let's just take a quick look here.
All right, here's actually an example that's going to sound off the wall, but I really mean this. We have an epidemic of especially teenage girl suicides. Everyone knows the numbers by now. Yeah. It went up 50% because of the COVID lockdown idiocy. 50%. All right, now we use a number like that, and what it does is it's not very human, right? It doesn't personalize something. But to bring this home, somebody, a mother and father, just had Christmas, 4 or 5 months ago, and their baby girl wasn't there opening Christmas presents. And they didn't sit there and read Bible stories and celebrate that day. They sat and wept because their baby girl's gone. We just found out the Center for Disease Control, who was issuing the guidance to the schools that the schools followed, they did that on behalf of the teachers' unions. The teachers' unions gave our Center for Disease Control school guidance. The Center Disease Control followed that political guidance, and teenage girls killed themselves. Not one person in power in the United States of America, not one, is calling for arrests and trials and prison time for anyone at the CDC. The most extreme you'll get is, well, someone should resign. Maybe Trump will get elected and fire somebody. Firings? Teenage girls are dead. Teenage girls are dead for political reasons. I don't want to ever hear about firings again. Public trials on television, live, so we, the American people, can witness what was done, and then Leavenworth for the next 50 years of your life. Or there's nothing worth saving.
Yeah. I mean, basically what Jesse Kelly's calling for is some sort of Nuremberg trial for the people that have been involved with what's happened. And again, we don't even have to debate the seriousness of a particular disease to talk about the harm that's been done. It's just a fact. Depression, suicide, drug use, unemployment, obesity, domestic abuse, all of these things skyrocketed. Again, you could believe that there's an illness serious enough to warrant a serious response, but the fact is that the well-being of children was basically sacrificed. I taught for about 7 years between my practice teaching and my professional teaching, and I loved my job. I absolutely loved it. I loved going into work and teaching the kids, coaching the kids especially. The leftists have turned teaching into this sort of like savior organization where if you didn't have teachers, we'd all be up the creek. But there is a nobility to teaching nonetheless. And even when I was teaching around a lot of leftist influence, I still always believed that despite the problems in the system, it was good that somebody like me was there. I was going to give the children the other side of the story. When they were going to come in and ranting and raving about how Donald Trump was going to murder everyone on earth, I was going to say, hold on, did the news actually say that? Or when I was teaching religion, Catholic religion in my Catholic school, which was publicly funded, they would come in and say, well, my parents said this, you can believe this as a Catholic. And I say, well, listen, you need to obey your parents. But this is what the church teaches, and it's not that. I would get in trouble a lot for teaching Catholicism. I would get in trouble a lot for promoting what were called conservative values, when in reality, I was just basically asking kids to look at both sides of the story. That was fine. I was used to that. I mean, to be persecuted as someone who wants to stand up for the truth, that's not really a big deal. But there was a certain point when I realized that I had to leave the teaching profession, even though I loved it so much. I was the kind of teacher where I would show up at like 6:30 in the morning to run before school practices. I would run clubs on my lunch break and not take a lunch myself. I would tutor kids during my spare time, my prep period. And then I would also run a second practice after school if I had to. I mean, there were times where I was putting in 65-hour work weeks as a teacher, going in after my kids were asleep. I was that kind of guy. I mean, I'm an enterprising fella. I like to do that sort of stuff. It meant a lot to me. And I always thought that, again, despite the problems in the system, from what I saw from most teachers was that they actually did, even if they had a view that I didn't believe in, they believed that it was worth going the extra mile for the kids. I didn't like how they would often go the extra mile. It was like, I'm going to go the extra mile to make sure you get to this like leftist indoctrination conference. I didn't like that. But the mentality of, we have an important job. We're going to go the extra mile to make sure that our kids were safe. That was there. It was totally co-opted by leftism, and that's a whole problem. But the reality is that the good people there, and they're still there, there are tons of them, they would try to make sure that kids who were abused, kids who were hungry, kids who had domestic violence or something like that, they would have a safe place to go to school. We can criticize the system all we want, but those safety nets were in place for those kids, and that should be applauded. It's there, it's good for them. And I remember probably 4 or 5 weeks before the first bout of lockdowns, and I was in a part of the school. It was called Student Success. Essentially, this is where kids who need extra help, whether it's because they're immigrants, they don't speak English very well, or because they've got some learning issues, or they've got some behavior problems, whatever. This is the place where students go to have success, hence the name Student Success. And I didn't teach in the Student Success department. But I would often go there because I enjoyed my colleagues who taught in that part, because I thought they were very down to earth because of the nature of the job that they did. And they were wonderful men. But also because I coached rugby. I coached some contact sports. So I knew that I could go down there and I could find students who had, let's say, a violent streak, but they needed someone to help them channel that. So I enjoyed being around those kids to give them something positive to do to help them graduate. And I remember talking to one of my colleagues, a wonderful man. And just before the lockdown, it was 3 or 4 weeks, no one knew it was coming. And, we were talking about how essentially, like, there are so many kids in this room right now that if the schools are not open, these kids, like, they're not going to eat lunch or maybe even breakfast or dinner, I remember talking with guidance counselor colleagues about, students who had gone through various forms of abuse at home. I would never, release any information. That's not what I'm going to do here. But just, wow, when they come to school, this is like the safe place for them. And it's so sad that they have to rely on a public institution for something safe when you would hope their home would be safe. But the fact is the school was there for them. Just 6 weeks before lockdown here in Ontario, the teachers were striking here. We were doing rolling strikes. And the strike was about how if kids had to do online learning, it would basically be the apocalypse. You can't learn in front of a computer as well as you can learn in a classroom. I agree. Especially when you're young. I mean, when you're older, maybe you can figure it out. But when you're young, I don't think it's a good thing. And they were fighting for this, ostensibly, they were fighting for this idea that the leader of the province wanted them to teach more kids online, and that was going to be bad for the kids, so they couldn't support it. There may have been a desire to get more money on behalf of the teachers, but we don't talk about that. In any case, when the lockdowns hit, regardless of what people think about what the risks were for any particular illness, which we won't name, I saw the whole teaching profession, 99% of my colleagues, go from, if we have the kids go online for school, it's the apocalypse. If the school's not open, there's no one to take care of these kids. I mean, we're talking about people we know. Talk to any teacher who teaches in a publicly funded school, any school. They know the gory details of what happens in the tragic personal lives of some of these kids. I remember when I started teaching, I was teaching at a school out in the country where it was very near sort of a welfare area. And I was learning about all the sexual abuse that had taken place in the particular community. And I remember telling my wife, and I just started crying. I couldn't believe that kids went through that. Teachers know this stuff. They know this stuff. They knew that when we closed the schools, that the children who had an escape at the schools would have no escape. They knew that the students who had terrible personal lives, poverty, computer illiteracy, and so forth, they knew they would greatly suffer from online learning. They knew that. They knew there were kids that weren't going to eat. But they all decided that they had to jump on the bandwagon, that the most serious illness precluded them from going to work no matter the cost to the children. Now, you might say that's unfair. And again, I'm not talking about a brief repose. It's okay. We're going to take a couple weeks, a month, try to figure this out. But there was no talk of getting back to school faster. There was no talk with any of the unions, any of the administration, none of them, about opening schools faster, about finding a solution, saying, hey, let's just ask all the teachers under the age of 50. They'll probably feel safer because of various things we know about what's going on. They're younger. We'll say teachers who don't have health problems. You can volunteer to work. We'll do our best. If parents want to send them, maybe they won't want to send them, but if parents need to send them, we'll have people who are willing to take the risk. I would have been willing to take the risk. But there was not even it wasn't even something that you could bring up and be taken seriously. I remember trying to bring some of these things up, and the answers I would get, well, we're in a pandemic. Well, now we're in a pandemic of suicide. Teachers, we have all heard stories of kids who commit suicide during the lockdown. You've heard it. We know that those kids who went home to those abusive homes were abused, and they weren't when we were at work. In ages past, we didn't ask our children to go sacrifice themselves for prosperity. We didn't tell 14-year-olds or 12-year-olds to go die by, doing something dangerous. The grown-ups would do that. Granted, in some wars, there's so many men who are killed that they have to go down to the teenagers. But the mentality that we've always had is the grown men have to go and do the fighting because we're going to protect the women and children. But with what happened with the lockdown ideology with teachers, it was that the children will just have to wait. The children are just going to have to suffer. They're just going to have to lose their education. They're just going to have to be depressed. They're just going to have to commit suicide, if that's what it comes to, because it's too risky for us to do anything about it. Now, again, even if you believe the narrative about what's happened for the last 2 years, it's still shameful that this has happened. Teachers' unions will tell you, if it wasn't for us, the trains wouldn't run on time. If it wasn't for kids going to school, the sun would fall out of the sky. Teachers are heroes, don't you know? Well, guess what heroes do? They risk their lives. They risk their lives. They risk their well-being so that somebody else can be made safe. Excuse me. When that happened, I had my reservations, but I believed at the end of the day that the teacher's position that I had, I believe that the system, although flawed, still had people who would ultimately, even in their flawed way, put the well-being of the kids first. I thought that. I couldn't believe it. Maybe I was naive. And just so everyone knows, the teaching profession here in Ontario is the holy grail of jobs. You get paid like $100,000 and you get your summers off. You get the best pension on earth. And I mean, the benefits are so unbelievable. You could pretty much go for a spa massage like every 3 days and never run out of benefits. It's unbelievable, the job. People get the job as a teacher and they'll pretty much swallow anything to keep that job because it's so good. Maybe that's the problem. Anyway, that's a side note. So it wasn't as if I was making, $32,000 a year at a terrible public school system in East, in some neighborhood in New York where I couldn't even pay my rent. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of risk to quit a job that doesn't even pay the bills. This was a very important job. It was the holy grail of jobs. But I knew that when that happened, it was obvious that when the chips were down, the kids were going to come second. So Jesse Kelly is right. He's correct. Jesse Kelly is exactly correct. The teachers' unions, he's talking about the states, but the same thing happened here. They hired consultants. One of them actually got caught working for the government and the teachers at the same time, which is just like hiring somebody to have two different government agencies negotiate with each other because the teachers are the government. He was on the take from the government science table and he was on the take from the teachers union to try to prove to the government science table why the schools shouldn't open. Anyway, the anger that's rising about what has happened, it really is just that. It's bubbling over. It's boiling over. And it's not going to be pretty when people finally kind of wake up out of their hypnosis they've been in, and they increasingly are. And especially when we see, God forbid, the long-term damage of what has happened. So, I don't know how you educate your kids. It's not my business, really. But I can tell you, at least from my experience, having spent 7 years in the system and seeing what happened when the lockdown hit, I can never say that the publicly funded teachers, at least, overall have the best interest of the students at heart. And anyone who tells you they do after what's happened the last 2 years is either ignorant or lying. Don't forget to check out that link in our description, not only for Noble Gold, our gracious sponsor, but click the link in our description to help us continue growing. Become a patron. I'm getting the locals set up, I promise. It's overwhelming all the stuff we got to do because you guys have been wonderful, but I got to keep up on it. That's all for today. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.